What's up everybody, welcome back. So finally a new video. It's been way too long and I'm sorry for that. There's just too much stuff going on in my personal life and that takes up most of my time and or energy at this moment. So yeah, I'm sorry there aren't too much videos lately, but I'll try and get back into it at some point. I just can't tell you when that will be. But for now, we'll have a new video, and I can hardly remember what we did in the last video, to be honest. We did something with the bullet traces and the weapons, I'm pretty sure. So we're going to continue with the weapons by setting up the projectiles. So that way we can choose if we want to use a trace weapon or a projectile weapon. So let's start by doing that. First of all, I'm going to create a new folder inside of the weapons folder. So that's going to be the projectiles folder. And in here, I'm going to create a new blueprint, and that's going to be an actor, and that's going to be the parent of all the projectiles. So let's call this BP projectile parent. And let's set up the actual projectile first. So for the class defaults, we want to make sure that we set this to replicate, and we also want to replicate the movement. And then we're going to set up the components. I'm going to use a simple sphere collision. So first of all, let's add a sphere. And let's call this the collision sphere. So I'm going to replace the default scene root. So we'll get rid of the annoying billboard over here. And then I'm also going to add a particle system. So I'm going to use cascade particle systems, but you can also use Niagara, obviously. So a particle system, and that's going to be the tracer. And that's pretty much all we need, except a projectile movement component, and that will make it behave like a projectile. So projectile movement, and let's add that one as well. So first of all, let's go to the sphere. We're going to set up the radius over here, so let's make it small, something like 3 or 4 units, and that should be fine. And then we want to set up the particle system. Let's see. I don't think we really need to do anything here. Let me double check. No, particle system should be good. The collision sphere, we're gonna set up the collision later, but we need to create an object channel for that, so we don't really need to set that up either. So let's continue to the projectile movement, and in here we just want to add some default stuff. So I'm going to set the initial speed to something like 1000. So we're going to be able to change this for each child projectile, so it doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to get rid of the gravity. And I also want to make sure that it's not automatically activated. So all the way at the bottom, auto activate, I'm going to disable that one. So that's the most important one over here. And then let's compile and save, and that should be good to go. Now we need a bunch of variables, and we want to set up some default stuff in the event graph. So first of all, let's tackle some of the variables. We're going to need a reference to the controller that owns this projectile. So we need the owning controller. And that's going to be of the type controller. So not a player or an AI controller, but simply controller. Object reference. And then we also want to be able to set the damage for this projectile. So let's add a damage variable, and that's a float. And we're going to be able to set a penetration. So we're going to set the maximum penetration for the projectile, and that's an integer. And one more thing that we need is a boolean, and that's going to tell us if this is explosive damage or point damage. So if we want to apply radial damage or point damage. So is explosion damage, and that's a boolean. Now we need a bunch more, but let's make those while we set up the stuff in the event graph. So let's go to the event graph, and let's start with begin play. We want to store the actual location where we spawned the projectile. So first thing we're going to do is get the actor location. And let's drag off here and promote this to a variable as well. And that's going to be the spawn location of the projectile. And let's plug that in over here. And then we need a variable for the impact emitter, or the particle system that we're going to use for the impacts. So let's create that one as well. That's going to be the impact emitter. Well, that should be fine. And that's a particle system again. So particle system object reference, and for begin play, let's add a default in here. So let's just plug it in, and I'm going to set it to impact and then metal medium or small or large, whatever you want. Just make sure we have a default in here. And then we're going to use the collision sphere to determine what's going to happen. So we're going to get the collision sphere, and all the way down we're going to grab the component begin overlap. So we're going to set up overlapping projectiles that will be able to penetrate players, but they will be blocking on stuff like models and walls and things like that. So we're going to start with the component overlap. This is when we hit a player, and we want to make sure that the server handles most of this stuff. So we're going to add a branch in here first, and we're going to check if we are the server. So is server. And then we want to make sure that we actually hit another actor. So we're going to drag off the other actor, and we're going to check if this is valid or not, and plug it into the true pin. And if we actually hit a valid actor, then we're going to make sure that we're not going to damage the same actor multiple times in the same way that we did for the tracing. So one projectile can overlap the same actor multiple times when he's flying through it. So we want to make sure that we don't apply damage 3 or 4 times. So we're going to add an array of actors to our variables. So let's call this the hit actors. And that's simply going to be an actor reference. And then we're going to turn it into an array. So we're going to drag it in with a getter, and we're going to add a unique item. Plug it into the isValid pin, and we're going to add the other actor from the overlap. So if the actor is already in the array, the integer over here will return -1, and if the actor is added to the array, then this will return the new index of the actor. So if this is smaller than or equal to 0, then if this is smaller than 0, then the item is not added because it's already in the array. So we're going to grab a branch over here, and we're going to check if this is greater than or equal to 0. And if that's true, then we want to apply damage to the actual actor. And in that case, we need to know if this is explosive damage or point damage. So first of all, let's grab a branch in here, and we're going to plug it into the true pin and use our is explosive damage boolean. So if this is false, we're going to apply point damage. So let's drag off the false pin and look for apply point damage. So that's the built-in stuff from the Unreal Engine. The damaged actor is the other actor from the overlap. So we're going to plug that in into the damaged actor. Then we're going to use our damage variable for the base damage. Hit from direction, we're going to grab our spawn location. And we also want to get the current location of the projectile. So get actor location. And we're going to get a unit direction vector. So we're going to start at the actor location, and let's get the unit direction vector to the spawn location. And that's the hit from direction vector over here. Then we need the hit information. So that's the structure that we can grab from the overlap over here, the sweep result. The event instigator is the controller that owns this projectile. So we're going to grab the owning controller and plug that in over here. And the damage causer is the actual projectile. So that's a reference to ourself. And let's plug that in over here. So that's if we want to apply point damage. And then if we want to apply explosive damage, then we're going to deal with that inside of the child blueprint of that actual projectile. So that way we can set up a different radius if we have a different projectile and things like that. That makes it a little bit easier without adding hundreds of variables over here. Okay, so now we also want to play some impact effects at some point. And we actually use a structure for that in our trace events. And we're going to use that same structure over here. So we're going to create a new variable and we're going to call this our projectile impact. Projectile impact. And that's a single variable of the type weapon impacts. So this is a structure that we created earlier in the series. So this one. And then we're going to set the replication for this to a rep notify. So that way we can use this kind of like a multicast event. And if the server sets this, then the clients know they will need to play an FX at that point. So what we're going to do is set the projectile impact over here. So let's grab a setter. And we also want to do that for the false pin over here probably. So let's go over here and let's make sure that we plug in the false pin. That's after the add unique node, and we're also going to grab the both of these pins. So that doesn't really make sense, does it? Okay, so let's disconnect it and let's simply add it right before here. That's a little bit easier. So right after the add unique node, it doesn't really matter if the actor, well, it kind of does, doesn't it? Yeah, because we also don't want to play 4 impact fixes for the same actor, probably. So what we're gonna do, I'm sorry, we're gonna plug it right over here into the true pin. So that way, if the overlap triggers multiple times on one actor, we still only have 1 impact fix. So that's how it should be. Now we're going to drag off the projectile impact and we're going to make a weapon impact structure. So we're going to need the location and the normal, and we can grab that from the sweep result. So let's break the sweep result over here. And then we want to grab the impact point for the location and the impact normal for the normal. So we're going to set up the onRep function later. Let's finish this part first. So we're going to play the actual impact fix inside of the onRep projectile impact function. Okay. So now we want to check if we have reached the highest level of penetration that we have. So as I mentioned, we're going to set up bullet penetration and we'll be able to set up maximum penetration. So we want to make sure that we don't penetrate too many actors. So what we're going to do is grab a branch over here. Let's grab both of the execution pins. Like so. And then we need another variable, and that's our current penetration. So this is simply an integer again. And we want to check if our current penetration is greater than or equal to our maximum penetration. So let's grab greater than or equal to, and the maximum penetration that we set later. So this is the variable that we're actually going to set on the projectile, and this simply counts how many actors we penetrated. So plug it into the condition. If this is false, we're simply going to increment the current penetration. So we're going to add 1. And if we actually reached our maximum, then we're going to grab our projectile movement component and we're going to stop simulating. Plug this one into the true pin, and we need to plug in a hit result over here. So again, we're going to grab the sweep result from the overlap event. So what this will do, this will trigger the on projectile stop event over here that we're going to add later. So we can implement this in multiple places and then simply define what we want to do in the projectile stop event. Okay, so that's the actual overlap event that we need. Now let's set up the projectile impact function. No, no, first let's continue into the event graph. That's a little bit easier probably. So as I mentioned, we're also going to have blocking hits for the collision sphere. So for that, we need to add the on-component hit event for the collision sphere as well. So we did overlap and now we're going to do hit. Again, we want to check if we are the server. So the first thing we're going to do is grab a branch, plug it in and check if we are the server. And then we also want to make sure that the projectile is still alive, by the way. So let's disconnect this and we're going to need a new boolean for that. Let's call it is projectile alive. So did it already penetrate enough actors or hit something? So that's a boolean. And we need to set it to true by default. So let's compile the blueprint and set it to true. So the projectile is alive when it spawns. And then we're going to grab an end node and plug both of them into the condition. And for the is projectile alive, we want to make sure that we set it to replicated, by the way. So let's set the replication to replicated. Now if this is true, then we're going to grab the projectile alive and set it to false immediately. So at this point the projectile is going to die. Now we also want to play the impact fix. So we're simply going to use our projectile impact variable with the impact structure. So let's copy this part and paste it down here. And then we're going to grab the hit result from the hit event and break it. And over here we can grab the impact point and the impact normal again. There we go. And then we want to destroy the actor, but because we have a rep notify variable over here, if we do this immediately, then the replication will not succeed because the actor is immediately destroyed. So what we want to do is grab a small delay over here, and 0.2 seconds should be enough. And then we're going to destroy the actor. So this will make sure the variable actually replicates and the onRep function actually fires on the client. So that should be good. And now let's continue with the projectile stop event as well. So let's go to the projectile movement. All the way down, we're going to add on projectile stop. So as I mentioned, this will fire when we call the stop simulating over here. And this is pretty simple. First thing we want to do is grab this part with the branches and the projectile alive, copy and paste it. So we want to make sure we are the server and we aren't already dead. And that's really all we need to do. Then we're going to plug this into the delay over here. We don't really need the delay, by the way, because we're not playing the impact effects. Yeah, that should be good. Yeah, that should be good. So let's just plug it into the destroy actor node and that should be fine. Okay, so now that we have this part set up, let's go to the onWrap function for the projectile impact. And in here, well, first of all, we want to spawn an emitter at location. So that's the impact emitter. So for the emitter template, we have a variable, the impact emitter template. Let's plug it in over here. Then we have the actual projectile impact variable. We're going to grab it and we're going to break it. Plug in the location and the normal, and this will convert it to a rotator. That should work fine. And then we want to make sure that if the projectile is not alive anymore, so we're going to grab the branch and check if projectile is alive. So if this is false, we want to destroy our particle system tracer, and the reason for that is otherwise we're going to still see the tracer for 0.2 seconds when the projectile is already quote unquote deleted. So the particle system is not replicated, so that's why we want to do it for each instance, and we're doing it inside of the onRep function. And to make sure that we're only deleting it when the projectile is actually quote unquote dead, we're gonna do it if the boolean is false. So we're gonna grab the particle system tracer. Let's double check if it's valid or not, or if it's already being deleted. Plug it into the false pin. And if it's valid, we're gonna destroy the component and plug that one into the valid pin. Okay, so that should pretty much be everything for our parent projectile. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at setting up the collision. So the collision, let's go to the project settings first. So edit project settings. And on the left side, go to the collision tab. So we want to create a new object channel for the projectiles. So let's do that first. Create a new object channel, call it projectile. And the default response is going to be block. So accept it. And then we want to take a look at two existing presets. So first of all, the pawn preset, and that's used for the capsule collision of the player character, for example. And we don't want to hit the capsule, but we want to hit the actual character mesh. So for the pawn over here, we're going to double click the preset. And then we're going to grab our projectile collision, and we're going to set it to ignore over here. So projectile, and tick the ignore box. Accept it. And then for the character mesh, we're going to double click the preset, and we're going to make sure that the projectile is set to overlap. And this will make sure that we'll be able to penetrate character meshes. So let's accept that as well. Now we could make a preset for the projectile as well, but I find that to be a tiny bit more confusing. So I'm just going to close it down, and we're going to go back to the parent projectile and set up the collision by hand. So we're going to go to the collision sphere and then scroll down to the collision presets. And simply select custom. Now we want to set the collision enable to query only, so that's good. Then we're going to set the object type to our new projectile object type. And then we're going to take a look at the responses. So we don't want it to respond to traces. So let's set all of the trace channels to ignore. And then we're going to set all of the other stuff to block, except for the pawn. And for the projectile, so we're going to block world static, world dynamic. Pawn, we're going to overlap those, because that's also the character mesh. And then we're going to block physics bodies, vehicles, and destructible meshes, and we're going to ignore other projectile. So if we set it up like this, we should be good to go. So we can compile and save that. And now there is one more thing that we want to do, and that's go to our actual player character. So let's go to the third person folder blueprints and open my third person character. So in here we could take a look at the capsule component. We don't really need to change anything in here, but as I mentioned, it's set to the pawn preset and the object type, and that's the most important thing. But because they are both named pawn, I find this to be a little bit confusing, but the object type is pawn, and over here our projectile is set to ignore. And if we go to the character mesh, then we have our object type pawn as well, but this time we have the projectile set to overlap over here. Now what we want to do for the character mesh is make sure that we have generate overlap events over here enabled, otherwise it's not going to work. So this is pretty important, enable it over here on the character mesh. Okay, compile and save that, and that should be good to go. So now we can take a look at creating a child blueprint to be able to create different types of projectiles. So we have the parent projectile over here, and for example, if we want to have a projectile that represents a bullet and another one that represents a grenade from a grenade launcher, then we can simply make different childs. So we're going to right click and create a child blueprint class. And let's call this projectile bullet and open it up. Now we really only need to set up the particle system, and let me see, the particle system and the projectile movement component. So for the particle system, I'm going to use the pistol tracer. So let's select the particle system over here, and then simply use the pistol tracer from my FX pack. So it's pretty big, and I want to make it a little bit thinner, not necessarily shorter. So I'm gonna set the X and the the Y and the Z axis to 0.5 scale. No, 0.5, not 5. There we go. And I'm gonna leave the X to 1, so it's a little bit thinner projectile. Oh. And then I want to move it back a little bit, so it's the tip is pretty much at the collision sphere. So that should be good to go. And then for the projectile movement, we're gonna make it a bit faster because this is a bullet. So let's make it something like 3000 for the initial speed and the maximum speed. And that should pretty much be all we need to do. Let me scroll down in my notes quickly. So now the next thing we want to do is go to our weapon component. And in the last video we created the fire weapon bullet trace, and we want to make a similar function so we can fire projectiles. So let's go to our weapons data folder and open the weapon component. So as I mentioned, we have the fire weapon bullet trace, and let's simply duplicate this function, and I'm going to call it fire weapon projectile. And we want to change it up a little bit, obviously. So first of all, we're getting our actor in focus, and we're determining the actual location where we're shooting at. So that's good. We're going to keep that part with the isValid node and the return node over here. So that's good to go. We're going to keep our local aim point and the shotgun boolean. And over here is where we want to start changing things. So let's do the lower branch first. For the shotgun is false, and let's get rid of the actual trace and the out hits and that kind of stuff. And we want to drag off the false pin over here, and we're going to spawn an actor from class. And we want to spawn our projectile, and we have it stored in a variable. That's our projectile class. Or we didn't create it yet. No, we didn't. So we're going to drag off the class, and we're simply going to promote it to a variable, and that's our projectile class. So we're going to add these variables later in our primary data asset, and that way we'll be able to make different weapons really easily. So the projectile class, and we need a spawn transform, so we're going to drag off and make a transform. And the location where we want to shoot from is our muzzle socket location. So that's good. We're going to keep that one. Let's disconnect these pins, plug it into the location as the starting point. And then we need the rotation, and we're going to use our unit direction vector again. So we're going to start at our socket location, and we're going to aim to our aim point. So that's good to go. We can keep the random unit vector cone in degrees, so we have a little bit of spread if you want to, otherwise you can get rid of this part. And then we don't want to multiply the vector, so let's get rid of the multiply by integer, and then we can simply plug it into the rotation, and that will convert it for us with the rotation from X vector. So that's the spawn transform. That should work fine. And then we need to continue over here. So because we have the class set up as a variable, the engine doesn't know what actor we're spawning, so we can't use instance editable variables. So that's why we need to cast over here. So we're going to cast to our parent projectile. And from the parent projectile, we're going to drag off and we're going to set our owning controller. So plug it in over here. And we do actually have that one in the variables. So let's plug it in over here. And we also want to set up the damage, the maximum penetration, and the is explosive damage boolean. So we're going to drag off the projectile again and set our damage. Plug it in and grab it from the variables over here. And then do the same thing for the maximum penetration. So set maximum penetration. We also have that in our variables. And the last one is the is explosive damage boolean. So set is explosive. Nope. So I misspelled that, obviously. So set is explosion damage, and we don't have that bool over here yet. So we're going to drag off, promote to variable. And let's make sure that it's spelled correctly this time. So is explosion damage. And that should be good. Now, if you remember, we chose not to activate our projectile movement component immediately. So that's what we need to do next. We're going to drag off the parent projectile and we're going to get our projectile movement component. So the actual component all the way down in the list. No. Oh, it's freaking out. Thank you. So there was a key stuck or something, I think. So drag off the projectile movement and we're going to activate it. So set active. And tick the new active. So it's activated after we set the variables. And plug it in over here. And that's all we need to do to spawn our projectile. So after that we can grab a return node and return. And we actually fired the weapon, so we're going to set the bool to true. Plug it in over here. Excuse me. And then we want to do the upper branch for the shotgun. And we can pretty much get rid of everything that we already have in there to make it a little bit easier. And we kind of want to do the same thing. So we're going to grab the spawn actor node with the cast and the setter for the variables. And also the activate node. Yes. So all this stuff over here, copy it and paste it above over here. So this is the true pin from the is shotgun branch. And we simply want to repeat this loop for the amount of pellets that this shotgun is going to fire. So we're going to grab our local shot count, and that should be in the local variables because we copied this function. So local shot count, and check if, no, first we need to increment it. So sorry, increment the local shot count. And after we incremented it, we're going to check if it's greater than or equal to our pellet count. So greater than or equal to, and grab the pellet count from our variables over here. So we're going to hook this up to a branch, obviously. And if this is false, we want to fire another projectile. So we're going to loop back to our spawn actor from class node over here. Let's make this look a little bit cleaner. There we go. And if this is true, then we're done. So then we can go to our return node over here. So this should be good to go. And because we don't use these arrays over here in the local variables, we can get rid of the local out hits and the weapon impacts array. And that's all we need to do. Oh yeah, we need to hook up the spawn transform for the second spawn actor node, and we can simply grab it over here. So the transform is the same, obviously, so we can just hook it up like that, and that should make it work. There we go. Now we are pretty much good to go to test it, I think, I hope. So because we haven't hooked everything up to our primary data assets, we need to simply set the variable in our weapon component. So we're going to set the weapon type, the default value, to projectile. And then we want to go to the projectile class and we want to select our bullet projectile. And now we should be good to go. So the other variables should still be set from the last video. So I have auto fire enabled and then a burst count of 4. And I also have a burst delay of 1.5 seconds. So that should make things pretty much work. Maximum penetration. Let's set penetration to 1 so we can test that as well. First of all, let's have a look and see if everything is working or not. So let's grab 2 players and hit play. So we still have the testing setup over here. And where is my second window? Over here. So the AI will start firing immediately as soon as he is focused on us. At least he should be. Okay, let's try that again. It does say start fire, but he's not actually firing, so something is kind of not working. Let me double check and I'll be back in a sec. Yeah, okay, obviously I forgot something. Just a little small detail. Inside of the AI weapon component, we still need to go into our event graph. And in here we have the fire weapon loop and we're checking the weapon type. And if we fire a projectile weapon, we need to call our fire weapon projectile function. So we're going to drag in the function over here and plug it into the projectile pin. And we're going to do the same thing over here. So we need a branch over here later, but for testing it's easier not to have it in here. So I'm not going to hook it up, but I'm going to put it in here. And after that, we want to continue to the trigger weapon fired. So we're going to plug that in right over there, like so. And then for later, it might be a good idea to add the false pins over here. So we're going to grab our AI fire weapon and our is firing boolean. And we want to set both of those to false and plug those into the false pins of the branches that are not currently hooked up, but we have it in place so we can't forget. Okay, so this should make it work a little bit better, hopefully. So let's hit play again and see what happens. So let's grab the client over here. So this time he is firing, and as soon as I'm in focus, he actually starts firing projectiles. And we actually have impact effects and we are registering damage, as you can see in the top left. And the projectiles are penetrating my character mesh, it looks like. Yeah, they pretty much are. And as we can see in the lower screen, they are not penetrating the actual cube over here. So as soon as they hit a world static or a world dynamic object or things like that, they will be destroyed. So that seems to be working, and if I'm going to stand right behind the other player, then the projectiles will penetrate the first mesh, but they will not penetrate the second mesh because we have the maximum collision set to 1. So that seems to be working, and we have impact effects and stuff like that for both the client and the server. So we have that replicated and working as well. So I think for the projectiles we are pretty much good to go, and we have a pretty solid base. So in the next episode, I'm going to show you how to set up a different type of projectiles. So we're going to create the rocket launcher, for example. And then more importantly, we're also going to finish up the setup for the primary data asset. So we're going to make sure that we can actually populate all of these variables from the primary data asset and easily create weapons like that. Okay, so that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed. I know it's been a long time and I'll try to be faster next time. Thanks for watching, bye bye.